Hello and welcome to the Energy Talk podcast. My name is Olubumi Olajide and thank you so much for joining us for another episode. On this podcast, we tell stories about the energy transition of sub-Saharan Africa, focusing first on the financiers, policymakers, and operators that are driving the industry forward and closing the energy access gap. On this episode, we're speaking with Justin Tinsey, the Vice President of Procurement Solutions at Odyssey Energy Solutions. We'll be learning more about Odyssey as a platform and about its financing facilities and logistics services it provides through its procurement team. And we're going to start off with Justin telling us how he got into the renewable energy industry. If this is your first time listening, don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you do find value in this episode, please recommend the podcast to a friend or a colleague. Now let's get into the conversation. Justin, welcome to the Energy Talk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Great to be here, Olu.
Yeah, thanks. I know this is a bit of a last minute thing, so I appreciate your flexibility on this. Yeah, I know you've not listened to many of the podcast episodes, so the way we like to start is to just tell the audience about what was your first interaction with the energy sector and how has that led you to your current position at Odyssey?
Okay, good question. My first interaction in the energy sector was actually selling gas turbine modular units from about 0.5 megawatt to actually anywhere up to 10 megawatts. I was a business development consultant for a company out of California. And then went from there into a kind of broader project development role. That kind of was my foray, but I didn't really get into renewables till later.
Yeah. Was Odyssey your first foot into the renewables energy sector?
No, it wasn't actually. So beyond what I just mentioned about the transition to the energy sector, my first transition actually to renewables was, funny enough, and you may appreciate this and maybe some of your audience that's Nigeria based. I was actually coming to Nigeria to sell consumer electronics wholesale. Ooh. So I was running around Computer Village, Lagos, if you're familiar, which is a very crazy place. Mm-hmm. And I was essentially trying to find customers for consumer electronics, and we were not successful. We did about 2 deals. One deal was with Congo, which was quite interesting. It was for Amazon Kindles. And we were trying to build off a lot of success we had in wholesale in South Africa. So we thought, Nigeria is a huge market. Yeah. Of course, what could go wrong? Let's just do in Nigeria what we did in South Africa. Yeah, it was. So anyway, to answer your question, at that moment, I was presented the opportunity to kind of spearhead a B2B solar distribution company in Nigeria. And that was my first real transition to renewables is, hey, here's a few containers of batteries, please sell it. And so,
it seems like you started right in the gauntlet of fire, it looks like. So right now, with your role at Odyssey, so just talk me through how you first started with the organization and what your role is within the ecosystem and what Odyssey stands to serve as impact within the energy ecosystem.
Sure. I'll start with the latter. Our aim is simple in my team in Odyssey, and that is to offer a better procurement experience. Odyssey as a company has 3 main business units. One is procurement, one is financing, and then maybe the last is remote monitoring and controls. And so historically, kind of Odyssey was supporting with financing, particularly a lot of concessional financing, as well as remote monitoring and controls. So, and I can tell you much more about this, but we've been supporting the Nigeria Energy Program for a long time. And so I was running around, particularly Lagos, doing equipment sales.
Yeah.
And so the kind of missing middle of any project cycle, we recognize is really procurement, which is where a big part of the CapEx goes.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of a natural marriage when I joined Odyssey, and then we decided to take this kind of full project cycle support system for every step of the way.
Yeah. So, and something very interesting, I don't know how familiar the listeners would be. Procurement, especially in Nigeria, is particularly challenging for many reasons. So like, I think the two major ones that come to my head is customs clearing, obviously, and FX, like just craziness. I think is the best way to describe it. With the two major ones, what was the initial drive? Because I know it's a very difficult operating environment working anything related to Nigeria, specifically with the Lagos ports. So how did your team scale up to address and be valuable to the renewable energy sector in Nigeria within a very short amount of time, I must say?
A lot of our kind of lessons learned and to scale up, we had to do what everyone did. We had to learn the hard way sometimes. We had to partner with different people. We had to eat a lot of costs sometimes. And so regarding the clearing, it's a huge challenge. It's an incredible challenge. I always say that it costs much more to get a container a kilometer after the port of Apapa than to get that same container from China to Apapa. So
yeah,
it's the reality. I think the best way is through experience and through building a trusted network of clearing and forwarding agents, and also to recognize that there's no shortcuts. We've seen in the industry that it is common for people to take shortcuts while clearing, and we don't do that as a company. So what we do is work with trusted, reputable clearing and forwarding agents, international companies supporting multinationals. But then we take it a step further, and we also complement our imports with certain things like duties exemptions and special import requirements. So we make sure everything is imported in the cheapest way possible. It never gets easier, but we also recognize that's the value we often provide for our clients, whether they're Nigerian clients or international clients. Yeah, it's always a tough nut to crack, but that's how we approach clearing.
Yeah.
Now for Forex, I was going to say that's the elephant in the room of every kind of business in Nigeria, but it's even bigger than an elephant. I don't even know what you would call it. It's it's a massive challenge, but I think what kind of gives us how we approach it, maybe to answer your question, Odyssey, is we know it's a challenge for everyone. There's nothing necessarily unique about it being a challenge for Odyssey. So we found some ways to de-risk the fluctuations. We keep pricing valid for a short period of time, for instance. We regularly update pricing on our website. So instead of sending a price list that's valid for 2 weeks or 30 days, as a lot of companies do, and then kind of hedge their bets on where the currency goes in that period, we say, no need for that. We'll actually just post the actual currency. Right now we're doing it daily, but at least we do it every 48 hours to kind of make sure that our Naira pricing is market reflective.
Yeah, good term.
Yeah.
When it comes to, I feel like Odyssey looks for where there is most value to be delivered and build solutions around that. So the reason why I brought that up is around your procurement facilities. So moving more towards the financing side.
Sure.
So there is DART. I'm forgetting the full acronym name, so maybe you can help us with that. And then there is the better payment terms.
Yes.
So first of all, I know that financing might be more of Odyssey's bread and butter at this point, but I want you to talk about both facilities, what kind of led up to creating them as is, how they've adapted with the recent FX crisis, and how you're looking to growing that support.
Sure. Okay, that's a loaded question, so I'll do my best.
Yeah.
No, it's we always joke at Odyssey and in the industry at large. We always enjoy our acronyms, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you throw in government initiatives to the mix. One favorite confusing one as a side note is REA, Rural Electrification Agency, and then REAN, Renewable Energy Association of Nigeria. It seems to be a common mix-up. But DART, to add another acronym, DART stands for Demand Aggregation for Renewable Technology. So for the audience, this is an initiative that Odyssey runs with All On, longstanding pioneers supported by Shell, supporting off-grid energy access in Nigeria, particularly for renewables. So we run this facility with them. It's a $25 million equipment finance facility. And the aim is to support renewable energy companies in equipment procurement and financing. Under that initiative, which was particularly designed with mini-grid developers in mind, mini-grid developers under the Nigeria Energy Program face the challenge of getting equipment to site because they often have to do that. They have to do that on their own balance sheet before DART came around, or with external financing. And then once they get equipment to site, often in the most remote parts of Nigeria, because by definition these developers are building mini grids which are supporting rural communities.
Yeah.
Then they don't get paid until after they bring the equipment to site. And then they don't even just get paid then. They have to commission it and then get paid and then wait 3 months before they get their full balance payment. So we recognize this was a unique opportunity to say, hey, this funding is backstopped by the World Bank. Although implemented by the World Electrification Agency. And so there has to be a way to develop a financing mechanism to support these guys. And so we came up with this DART facility, which allows repayment for up to 2 years after a 6-month moratorium.
Yeah.
And it allows, amongst other things, it allows a Naira repayments, which is very beneficial because, of course, if companies were to just want to take dollar loans and then get paid in Naira, they'd run away. So we've deployed now almost $12 million under that facility. And it's not only for mini grid developers, so we're excited to entertain applications for what they call solar for productive use with partners such as Sustainable Energy for All. So we're supporting a few customers under that program, as well as the broader commercial and industrial private sector market is open to apply. There's a lot of due diligence that goes into that to make sure that the off-taker and others and the company is eligible. But yeah, that's the DART facility.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
So maybe we can dwell on that a bit before we move to the better payment terms.
Sure.
I know that there are several parts of DART that have been forced to adapt due to market conditions. So what I want to talk first about is the Naira repayments. As you identify, one of the huge operational issues developers face is the fact that a lot of their capex and operational costs relating to equipment is all in USD payments. So they have to source the dollars however and pay them. But most of the revenues they collect, mostly apart from subsidies, are going to be in Naira. Even with that, the currency exchange rates has really messed up a lot of financial models, I'm guessing. But how important is it to Odyssey to kind of maintain the angle of the option to repay in Naira? And how has that actually worked out in real market situations?
It's tough. I would say that, again, it's not just Odyssey's challenge. And so the way we've approached it is this is really everyone's challenge. And we wonderfully have partners with All On, which is supported by GIAP, to add another acronym, which is the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is active all over developing world, supporting energy access. And so, DART is really led, supported in the background by them. But we're all willing to take that risk, so to speak, on the Forex challenge because we want to deploy these assets to allow communities to access better power at better rates. So with the changing environment, and then maybe particularly what you're referring to is kind of the option to repay makes it very attractive for EPCs and installers because they're essentially seeing a spread between the dollar and Naira rate. But if there were liquidity of dollars in the market, All On and us would accept dollar-based repayment. But because there's not, we have to be real to the reality of that kind of central bank rate. Yeah. And so, as you and maybe many listeners know, there's still a gap in the market. And there is still the guarantee under the DART facility that you can repay at these certain rates. And we believe that assurance is very attractive still. And it seems to be the sentiment still with developers that, okay, repaying in Naira at these rates is still attractive. And it's still a much better loan and option than we could get via other commercial vehicles.
Yeah.
We're trying to, and so the feedback's good. I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, but
so I since I started kind of paying attention to the financing options, I've seen some crazy debt facilities with some very interesting looking interest rates. So that I think is very appreciated within the current ecosystem. And now moving on to better payment terms. I know it's gone through several naming iterations. So sure. Could you talk about that a bit and how it differs from the DART facility and what exactly it's looking to address within the energy ecosystem?
Absolutely. Thank you. So developers, EPCs, solar companies, they face a challenge of working capital. Just like DART helps address working capital, particularly for mini-grid developers, but others more broadly. There's a real need for working capital solutions for the average solar company doing let's say 50 kilowatts and above, or several small sites of 50 kilowatts and below. As you mentioned earlier, at Odyssey, we like to kind of work backwards based on problems. So we saw a big problem there that, okay, a lot of developers are having issues paying their suppliers and meeting those payment terms, which are usually 100% upfront payment before shipment from China, with some exceptions. So we said, okay, Nigeria is a huge market. We've been playing in the market for a long time. Kenya is a huge market. South Africa is a huge market. And we know that renewable energy equipment sells in those markets. And so what we're willing to do at Odyssey is look at those specific pieces of equipment that quote unquote sell in those markets. And take the quote unquote risk on procuring equipment on behalf of developers. I'll say developers broadly, I should say renewable energy companies, if they pay us a small down payment, 10 or 15% down. And so if they pay that 10 or 15% down payment, we will then pay their supplier. If it's a supplier that Odyssey has a great relationship with, and there's many that we do, we have framework agreements with many, for instance, that allow for best price guarantee on the FOB or CIF procurement. So a lot of companies feel comfortable using Odyssey simply for that reason. But hey, if not, if you have a great relationship with the supplier, no problem. Introduce us collaboratively. We'll use your pricing that you negotiated. We'll do everything transparent. We'll import everything to Nigeria. And then you can pay us that balance, 85 or 90% balance payment within a grace period of 60 days. So the way it works is we pay the supplier. The production time is usually 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the equipment. Usually another 3 to 4 weeks sailing, another 2 to 3 weeks clearing in Nigeria.
Fingers crossed.
If anyone tells you they can clear in a week in Nigeria, I'll tell you that they're not telling the truth. Let's just say that. Yeah, and then once it lands in our warehouse in Abuja or Lagos, then the 60-day period kicks in. So it's really a working capital solution for months, several months, as much as 3 to 6, 7 months we've seen. So yeah, that's what it works, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's called better payment terms. So instead of paying your OEM up front or your supplier on their terms, you can work with Odyssey. We agree on all the pricing beforehand, and we will deal with the headache of the port, and we'll bring it in for you.
Yeah, it's very interesting when I see companies that are trying to operate in a very impact-driven space with a very commercial mindset, because I think people are realizing that subsidies and concessional funding can only take us so far. We have to really start worrying about how do we make returns on investment and how do we deploy projects that actually make commercial sense. I feel like that's where the industry is moving to widely. But I want you to talk about the risk in the sector, because there are risks. And you mentioned your KYC. So I know that between when, let's say, a developer starts the process of like seeking funding to when they end, it can be like 12 to 18 months. So how do you deal with that challenge? Because on the flip side, it's the facilities that are looking at the companies trying to figure out, are they actually good for what we are kind of like getting into them? So what does KYC look like from Odyssey's perspective? And when you think of risk, what are the key factors you're actually looking at to determine if a relationship is worthwhile or if somebody is worth betting on with one of your facilities?
Sure. It's funny. I was just with our commercial capital team this past week in Lagos, and I think they'd have an entirely different take on your question. So I'll come from the equipment perspective, and that's a few things. Number one is we have an initiative called Forward Procurement, where we simply buy equipment with the intent to resell. And we do this because we know that there is the timeline for renewable energy equipment is massive, and particularly in Nigeria, the small installers. This is a country full of small installers, as you know. I mean, the informal market is huge, and we believe there's thousands. We know there's thousands of installers in the country. And so the way we quote unquote de-risk it for those guys is we take that risk of supply chain, and we take that risk of holding stock. We don't like to sit on stock long, but we do that full supply chain risk, and then we do it on cash and carry. So we do not take that credit risk on the majority of the market, simply because we understand that's honestly how a lot of the market works, is cash and carry. And so we're used to that. So that we play by those local rules in that way.
Yeah.
Another way we do it is in the initiative I just mentioned. You may recall me saying we look at the specific equipment of what's selling in the market.
Yeah.
So Odyssey is not a bank. We have this commercial finance team that makes partnerships with banks, just like we make partnerships with OEMs in my team. But what we do is we say, okay, is there demand in that market? And so if we're stuck with a container of batteries, for instance, we better make sure that's a typical 48-volt building block, that it's compatible with many different inverters, and that we have a high confidence that we could resell it.
Yeah.
And that's not to necessarily de-risk the renewable energy company we're selling it to. It's just the reality that maybe their project went bellies up. Things happen, particularly in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And so we de-risk it in the sense that we only do this in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. We're not doing this though I love the country, in the Gambia. We're not offering this initiative there.
Yeah.
And so it's the market and the equipment is how we really de-risk a lot of what we do. Now, we also, long answer to your question, but another way we do it is we partner with local banks and financiers. There's a number of people trying to address this challenge of, okay, I said it's called better payment terms. The best payment terms would be, okay, get it to site for me. Allow me to pay you over 2 years or 3 years, right? Well, we all know, okay, we don't know what the Naira is going to do let alone a month from now. And so we do have partnerships, though, with local banks, FCMB, for instance, for one, where there's certain facilities available and specific green energy-focused facilities that make capital attractive for deployment. And we also are in talks with quite a few number of partners, such as Sunfi, you may know them locally, that is specifically trying to address this challenge.
Yeah. And when it comes to the KYC aspect, how have you grown that process over time when it comes to assessing developers?
Well, in our team, because of those mechanisms, we don't necessarily take the risk on that developer. So the partner financier, FCMB, would say, okay, who's the developer? What's the balance sheet? 3 years audited financials? Who's the offtake? Then they would say, okay, Odyssey, go ahead and release. We'll pay you, then you could release the equipment to the site. Or we'll pay the developer, they pay you, then you can release the equipment to site. So we don't necessarily do that. What we do is instead say, we'll flip the script a little bit and say, what equipment do you want? You know, and where is it going? We could get it to Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt, our network of supply chain partners, but we still want to get paid before it leaves our warehouse. We'll then refer accordingly for a working capital short-term solution.
So that's a very interesting approach. And when it comes to generally now the impact of your work since you begun, is there any particular project that you look back to and say that, okay, I really like the way this particular thing turned out, or when you've seen the facilities or your procurement solution make a real difference to a project or a developer's operational process?
Yeah, I'll give two things that come to mind. One is there's major projects we're doing with a lot of big developers in Nigeria. And those are rewarding in themselves because they're often powering full communities. So those are rewarding projects usually in the sweet space of 200 kilowatts to a megawatt, which is, I think, the exciting part, particularly about the Nigerian market, where there's plenty of those projects. So we're doing that with the likes of Mask, for instance, a company based here in Abuja that's also using the DART facility. We're doing that with Nio Tropical, one of our long-term partners here, GVE, Haven Hill, and even PowerGen we're supporting, albeit for commercial and industrial projects. We're working with all those guys. I'd say that's the big project impact answer. What excites me most is to see the small guys benefiting because, again, there are thousands of those guys, whether it's directly selling 5-10 inverters or batteries, or it's simply selling to mid-sized distributors whom we're also partners with to then sell to those guys, or maybe even take that credit to those guys. So those pieces are what excites me, is to see an installer's kind of light bulb go off to say, oh, I understand the benefits of lithium versus lead acid now, and I can incorporate that into my ROI to get more money over the long term of the asset. Let's say if it's a power as a service offering. Yeah, there's a long answer to your question, but those are the things that I see very impactful of what we do.
And I think 3 more things before we wrap this episode. I know this is generally a very collaborative space. So how have you handled the whole stakeholder engagement? Because I know that with the work you're doing, you're talking with banks, developers, suppliers, and I'm guessing in some case the REA and other government agencies. So how have you approached the stakeholder landscape, and how do you see that developing over time?
Sure. Well, the easiest answer to that is teamwork. We're a wonderful collaborative team at Odyssey, and we have within finance a commercial capital team and a concessional capital team. So we are always exchanging information about what projects are coming up, what is needed, what's the pain points. I'm introducing someone who needs batteries to a funder, for instance, FCMB, for instance, as I named. So we don't do it alone. We also have a remote monitoring and controls team, which is really great. They kind of work behind the scenes a lot at Odyssey to help say, okay, when these assets are deployed, how are you going to see them easily on one screen? How are you going to track the performance of these assets, both commercially and technically? And so that may be particularly relevant to, let's say, a funder or, to answer your question, a stakeholder that may not come with the lens that I often come with, which is what equipment do they need? What's the price? So we work cross collaboratively there to as an industry enabler is the best way to think of us.
Yeah. And from your perspective right now with Odyssey, how do you see the industry really progressing? What are the key metrics that you're looking for the next year? I know that it can be very unpredictable to make predictions long term in the Nigerian market, but what are things you're looking at that you see as the most important metrics for the development of the sector, and how do you see them going right now?
And you mean in Nigeria specifically?
Yeah, Nigeria specifically.
Okay. First of all, the elephants in all of our rooms, right? So the Forex challenges, those need to be particularly sorted. I've seen in but that's an issue that all of us have to deal with. Forex clearing issues. I could say, okay, you need to remove duties on renewable equipment, which hasn't been done. But again, we all face those challenges. But where I see the industry going, doubling every year. I think I've witnessed that in the last nearly 5 years in the renewable space, particularly. It's so exciting, like I mentioned, to see companies switch to lithium for the first time and then almost never go back, only if the client is super price sensitive and really short-term thinking, which also happens. So I see that doubling. I see storage really taking off. There's a lot of projections with some of our OEM partners, like Huawei, for instance, where we've just become official Huawei representatives in Nigeria, which is very exciting because Huawei has a huge team and they have great equipment, great tech support. And so their numbers are very high in terms of where the market's heading. So I won't necessarily stick to any numbers here, but I will say storage for me is the most exciting part of the market.
Yeah. Okay. And this is the last question, but it might be the most loaded one, so there might be a follow-up FYI. How would you define failure for the future of the work that Odyssey wants to be doing? You brought up things like FX challenges, you brought up scale, you brought up stakeholder management and financing and equipment procurement and all these things. So I know you have a very optimistic outlook to where the industry is headed, but there's no doubt that there are going to be a lot of really interesting challenges that come up within that time. So how would you define failure for the work that Odyssey wants to do, and with the foundations that you've laid in place right now, you and your team?
Yeah, I feel like I'm not going to say anything too unique here, but I'll come back to the basics, and that's, it's not trying, right? So first of all, we got to try. So I think that's where the industry is right now. There's a lot of programs, as you mentioned, that are getting subsidy support. So let's try to bring energy access through these programs. Another thing is simply doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. So if there's some initiative that we're trying and we do it 2 or 3, slightly different ways, or the same ways rather, then we got to change. Failure's continuing to do that. So those two things come to mind. Nigeria's in an evolving, interesting market, so we just have to stay localized as well. I think always keep close to your partners and hear what they're saying and why they're saying it and why they're adopting certain technologies is incredibly important. So failure for us would be just to think we know everything. No, Nigeria will always surprise you and has something to teach you.
Thank you for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And if you do want to reach out to Justin or learn more about Odyssey's DART or Better Payment Terms facilities, I have contact information in the show notes of the episode. And since you have listened this far, you should subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'll see you next time on the Energy Talk. Have a great day. Bye-bye.